painted my cabin green. That's it. That's all I did. I inherited this beautiful 3-acre property, fixed it up with my own hands, painted it a deep forest green with cream trim, and made it mine. Then she showed up. A woman named Brenda. White SUV. Oversized sunglasses. The kind of person who has HOA president basically tattooed on her forehead. She walked onto my property without asking, looked around like she was inspecting a crime scene, and told me my house was ugly, that the color violated community standards, that I had 30 days to repaint it beige, just like every other soulless box in this neighborhood, or start paying $50 a day in fines. I should have just repainted it, but I didn't. Instead, I did something that would completely destroy her life and expose everything she'd been hiding. And it all started with one simple decision. I decided to read the HOA rulebook. What I found in there was going to change everything. Watch what happens when one person finally decides to fight back. You know that feeling when you finally find your peace? That quiet place where the world just stops? I had that with my cabin. It was sitting on about 3 acres of beautiful land, tucked away in this little community just outside of town. The cabin itself was, well, let's just say it had character. Real character. I'd inherited it from my uncle about 5 years ago, and I spent the first year fixing it up on my own terms. I painted it a deep forest green with cream-colored trim. I built a wraparound porch out of reclaimed wood. The roof was a beautiful slate gray that looked almost silver when the sun hit it just right. It wasn't conventional. It wasn't cookie-cutter. It was mine. But apparently that was a problem. I remember the day I first saw her. I was out front, staining the porch steps, when this white SUV pulled up to my mailbox. Out stepped a woman who looked like she'd stepped straight out of a suburban nightmare. Blonde hair pulled back so tight it looked painful. Oversized sunglasses. Golf visor. The whole 9 yards. She walked across my property, didn't even ask, and just started looking around. I stood up, wiped my hands on my jeans, and waited. "Hi there," she said, her voice sharp as a knife.
I'm Brenda Mitchell.
I'm the president of the Clearwater Ridge Homeowners Association. I hadn't even known there was an HOA. I mean, I'd seen the little sign when I turned onto this road, but I thought that was just for the main development, not for properties like mine that were set back from everything else. "Nice to meet you," I said, trying to be friendly.
I'm Marcus.
"Yes, well." She looked around again, and I could practically see her mind calculating something. "We have certain standards here at Clearwater Ridge." My stomach dropped. "Standards?" I asked. "The aesthetics of this community are very important to us," she continued, and now she was walking around my cabin like she was inspecting it for damage. The color scheme, for one thing, the architectural integrity, the general upkeep. I watched as she pointed at my cabin, then at the other houses visible in the distance. They were all beige, all of them. Beige with white trim, or white with gray trim, or gray with beige trim. It was like someone had decided that all happiness should be drained from the world, and then built a neighborhood around that philosophy. "My house looks great," I said, keeping my voice level. "And it's on my property." "Well," Brenda said, turning to face me with this smile that wasn't really a smile, "that's what we need to discuss. You're part of this community now, whether you like it or not. There are rules, covenants, conditions, and restrictions. You would have received them in the paperwork when you took ownership." I remembered seeing a thick document. I'd skimmed it, saw something about maintaining the property, nothing about what color I could paint my own house, and set it aside. "I don't remember anything about paint color," I said. "Section 4.2, subsection C," Brenda said, and she said it like she'd memorized this particular section specifically to use against people like me. "All exterior structures must maintain a cohesive aesthetic with the established community standards. The board determines what constitutes acceptable aesthetics." "The board," I repeated. "Me," she said. "Mostly me. I've been president for 8 years, and I haven't had any complaints about my interpretation of the rules." Of course she hadn't, because apparently everyone else in this neighborhood was beige. "So what are you saying?" I asked. "You want me to repaint my house?" I'm saying we should schedule a meeting with the board, she said. We're very reasonable people. We'll give you options. You can repaint to one of our approved colors, or you can appeal to the board, though I should tell you I don't recommend it. These things rarely go well. It was a threat. A soft threat, but a threat. I nodded slowly. I'll think about it. You have 30 days, Brenda said. After that, there will be fines, starting at $50 a day. Then she walked back to her SUV and drove off. I stood there, staring at my beautiful green cabin, and I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't anger exactly. It was something deeper. It was a slow, creeping realization that I'd made a terrible mistake by assuming that just because I owned this place, I could do what I wanted with it. I was wrong about that. But Brenda? She was about to find out that she was wrong too. For the next week, I did nothing. I didn't call the HOA. I didn't respond to the formal notice they sent me. I just let the anger simmer and build and grow until it became something else entirely. Something cold. Something calculated. I started doing research. I drove around the neighborhood at different times of day. I took photographs. I made notes. And what I found was interesting. Very interesting. You see, in all of Brenda's zeal to maintain her community standards, she'd apparently overlooked some very specific and very important rules in that massive HOA document. Section 7.1, subsection A stated that no resident could park a commercial vehicle on their property for more than 48 consecutive hours. The violation could result in fines up to $100 per day. Brenda had what looked like a commercial landscaping truck parked in her driveway, and according to the records I found, it had been there for at least 3 weeks. Section 5.4 stated that all exterior paint had to be refreshed every 7 years, or it would be considered unmaintained. I drove by Brenda's house with a paint color chart I'd printed from Home Depot, and her white paint was peeling. Definitely peeling. Section 6.3 prohibited any lawn or landscaping from exceeding 12 inches in height except in designated garden areas. Brenda's back corner, visible from the road, had weeds that looked like they were pushing 18 inches. Section 8.2 prohibited any trash or recycling containers from being visible from the street. Brenda's bright blue recycling bin was sitting right next to her driveway where it could be seen from 3 different angles. And then there was Section 12.1, which stated that any modifications to the exterior of the home, including but not limited to new decking, new fencing, or new hardscaping, required written approval from the board at least 30 days before beginning the project. Brenda's new hot tub deck, which I could see from the corner of her property, definitely hadn't been there the last time I drove past, which was only about 6 weeks ago. I wasn't going to do anything illegal. I wasn't going to do anything violent or destructive. I didn't have to. I just had to make sure that someone, somewhere, filed official complaints about all of these violations. And I knew exactly who could help me with that. The next morning, I called my cousin Derek. Derek was a lawyer, and more importantly, Derek had been living in this neighborhood for about 6 months. He'd actually told me when I first moved in that he hated the HOA but figured it wasn't worth fighting them. He was about to change his mind. I need to file a formal complaint, I told him over coffee at a local cafe. Officially. With documentation. Derek raised an eyebrow. You? Not about me, I said. About Brenda. I laid out everything I'd found. Derek listened carefully, sipping his coffee, his lawyer brain spinning through the details. When I finished, he set his cup down slowly. This is a lot, he said. This is really detailed. I know. If you file this officially, she's going to know it was you. Probably, I admitted. But I'm also going to file one more thing. I pulled out a photograph I'd taken the day before. It was from the property line of Brenda's house, and it clearly showed the hot tub deck, the trash can violation, the peeling paint, and in the distance, the commercial truck. I'm going to request a formal inspection of all properties in the neighborhood, I said, including hers. And I'm going to do it under my rights as a property owner to ensure consistent enforcement of the covenants. Derek stared at me for a long moment. Then, very slowly, a smile spread across his face. That's diabolical, he said. That's justice, I replied. 2 days later, I submitted the official complaints to the HOA board. I included photographs, dates, section numbers, and specific language from the covenants. I requested that an independent inspector verify all violations. Then I submitted my request for a neighborhood-wide inspection to ensure consistency and fairness in enforcement. I was completely within my rights. The covenants specifically allowed for any resident to request an inspection if they had concerns about fair enforcement. For 3 days, nothing happened. Then, on the 4th day, my phone rang. It was Brenda. "What did you do?" she asked, her voice trembling with rage. "I filed official complaints," I said calmly. I was exercising my rights as a homeowner to ensure fair and consistent enforcement of the community covenants. "You're making a mistake," she spat. "No," I said quietly. "I don't think I am. You're going to regret this." But I was already finding that I didn't regret it at all. In fact, I was just getting started. The inspection was scheduled for the following week, and Brenda apparently discovered that even the president of the HOA wasn't above the rules. She'd have to fix everything or face the same fines that she'd threatened me with. But here's where things started to get really interesting. You see, Brenda didn't just accept this. She fought it. She called an emergency board meeting. She tried to have me removed from the neighborhood association. She tried to argue that my complaints were frivolous and filed in bad faith. But the covenants were very, very clear, and I had documentation of everything. The inspection went forward. Brenda's violations were all confirmed. She was given a notice of violation and a timeline to correct the issues. And the fines started accumulating. But Brenda wasn't going down without a fight. What happened next? But Brenda wasn't going down without a fight. What happened next was something I didn't fully anticipate, even though I probably should have. Brenda started playing dirty. She called an emergency HOA board meeting, and she invited me. I showed up thinking maybe she wanted to negotiate, to work something out. Maybe she'd realized she was wrong and wanted to move past this whole thing. I was incredibly naive. The board meeting was held in the community center. This sad little building that smelled like stale coffee and broken dreams. There were 5 board members total, including Brenda. When I walked in, they were all sitting at a long table, and Brenda had this expression on her face like she'd just won the lottery. "Thank you for coming, Marcus," Brenda said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "We have some concerns we'd like to discuss." "Okay," I said, sitting down across from them. "What kind of concerns?" That's when she pulled out a stack of papers. And I mean a stack. It had to be at least 50 pages. According to Section 3.1, Subsection B, all residents are required to maintain their properties in a state of continuous improvement. Brenda read, adjusting her glasses. "We've reviewed your property records, and we have some issues." My stomach tightened. "What issues?" "Your driveway," she said. "There are 3 small cracks in the asphalt. According to regulations, any visible damage to hardscaping must be repaired within 60 days or face fines." She flipped a page. "Your mailbox post appears to be slightly weathered. Section 2.4, Subsection E requires all mailbox components to be maintained in like-new condition." Another page. "Your deck railing, the wraparound porch you're so proud of, has a few splinters on the 3rd plank from the right. That's a safety hazard, and you're liable for any injuries that might occur." I felt my jaw clench. This wasn't about the green paint anymore. This was personal. "And," she continued, her voice taking on this triumphant tone, "we've received a complaint from a neighbor about excessive foot traffic on your property during evening hours. Section 11.2 prohibits activities that could constitute a nuisance or disturbance to neighboring residents." I hadn't had anyone over in weeks. "Who complained?" I asked. "We don't disclose complaint sources," Brenda said smugly. "But we do take them seriously." I looked at the stack of papers on the table. Every single page was dedicated to finding some technicality, some rule buried in that massive covenant document that I could be fined for. She was trying to bury me under a mountain of regulation. And then it hit me. She was also proving my point. "You know what?" I said, standing up. "I appreciate you laying all of this out. Really, this is helpful." Brenda's smile faltered slightly. "I'm going to take all of these violations you've documented and file them as evidence in my appeal of the inspector's decision," I continued. I'm also going to request an audit of how the board has been applying these covenants over the past 8 years. The room went quiet. You can't do that, Brenda said, but her voice had lost some of its certainty. Actually, I can. Section 13.7 explicitly allows any resident to request a full audit of board compliance with covenant enforcement if they believe there's been discriminatory or selective application of rules. And you've just given me 10 pages of new complaints about my property in the past month, while apparently overlooking your own violations for years. I picked up the stack of papers. Also, in response to the complaint about foot traffic, I'd like to formally request the identity of the complaining neighbor. If they're making false or exaggerated claims about my property, I have the right to face my accuser, so to speak. That's basic due process. Derek had coached me on this. He'd made sure I knew my rights down to the last syllable. Brenda's face was turning red. This meeting is adjourned, she said, standing up abruptly. I nodded politely and walked out, but I wasn't done. That night, I sent an email to every single resident in the neighborhood. Not a complaint, not a rant, just a friendly message introducing myself, since I was relatively new to the community. In the email, I included a link to the public HOA records, which I'd obtained from the county clerk's office. These records showed the exact amounts that Brenda and the other board members had been fined, and when those fines had been levied. What those records showed was interesting. Over the past 8 years, Brenda had received exactly 0 violations. The other 4 board members had received a combined total of 2 violations, both minor, and both from 3 years ago. Meanwhile, residents who weren't on the board had an average of 4 to 5 violations per year. I didn't say anything in my email. I didn't point this out. I just provided the information and let people draw their own conclusions. Within 2 days, my phone started ringing. Residents were calling. Residents were coming by my property. They wanted to know why the rules seemed to be applied so unevenly. They wanted to know why Brenda's violations hadn't been handled with the same severity as everyone else's. And they wanted to know why they hadn't been told about their rights to request inspections and audits. By day 3, I'd received 17 phone calls and 12 visits. By day 4, someone filed a formal complaint against the entire board for selective and discriminatory enforcement of the covenants. I didn't file it. I had nothing to do with it, but I had a pretty good idea who did. Derek had taken one look at those records, had a conversation with another neighbor named Patricia who ran an accounting firm, and they decided to take action themselves. Because it turned out that Patricia had been fined 3 times for violations that, upon closer inspection, were ridiculously minor. She'd been written up for having a garden hose visible from the street, for having one corner of her roof that had a slightly different shade due to weathering, for having a bird feeder. Meanwhile, the board members had been operating under what amounted to a different set of rules entirely. On Friday of that week, Brenda called me directly. "This has to stop," she said, and now her voice sounded different. Not angry, scared. "What has to stop?" I asked innocently. "I'm not doing anything. You're turning the entire neighborhood against me." "No," I said. "You did that yourself. I just made sure people had access to the information they needed to make informed decisions." There was a long silence. "What do you want?" Brenda finally asked. I thought about it for a moment. "I want you to accept that my house is beautiful the way it is. I want you to withdraw the violation notice. And I want you to commit to fair and consistent enforcement of the covenants going forward. And if I don't, then the audit goes forward," I said. "And based on what I'm seeing, it's going to get very ugly for you." Brenda hung up without responding. I didn't hear from her for a week, but I heard plenty from other people. The neighborhood was in chaos. Residents were organizing. Patricia had connected with an attorney named Linda, who specialized in HOA disputes. They were building a case. They were documenting everything. And then something unexpected happened. I came home one Tuesday afternoon to find a notice on my door. Not from the HOA. From the county. It was an official inspection notice stating that my property had been flagged for a potential zoning violation. My heart stopped. I read it 3 times to make sure I understood it correctly. According to the notice, Someone had reported that my cabin might be operating as an unlicensed rental property or bed and breakfast. The county wanted to inspect and verify the property's actual use. It was completely false. I'd never rented out my cabin to anyone. But I knew exactly who had filed that complaint. Brenda. And now she'd escalated from HOA violations to actual county code violations. This was a different level entirely. This wasn't just about community regulations anymore. This was about getting government agencies involved. This was about trying to take my house away. I called Derek immediately. "This is crazy," he said when I explained what had happened. "She's retaliating. This is absolutely retaliation." "Can she do that?" I asked. "She can report it. Whether the county investigates seriously or not depends on them." "But Marcus, this is escalating in a way that I didn't anticipate. What do I do?" "We need to get ahead of this," Derek said. "I'm going to call Linda. We need to document everything. We need to show a clear pattern of harassment and retaliation." The county inspector showed up 3 days later. She was a tired-looking woman in her 50s who seemed to have better things to do than investigate a perfectly legitimate residence. She walked through my cabin for about 15 minutes, took a few photos, asked me if I rented it out or used it for any commercial purposes. I said no. She nodded and left. I got the report 2 weeks later.
No violations.
The property was a private residence. No commercial activity detected. But the damage was already done. Because in filing that report, even though it came back clean, Brenda had sent a message to me loud and clear. She was willing to do anything to win. She was willing to drag in government agencies. She was willing to risk legal consequences. She was willing to turn a neighborhood dispute into something far more serious. And I had to make a decision about how I was going to respond. Because I'd been playing this game by the rules so far. I'd used information. I'd filed legitimate complaints. I'd requested audits and inspections. Everything I'd done was legal and justified. But rules could only take me so far. Brenda had just proven that. I stood in my cabin that night, looking out at the green walls I loved so much, and I realized that this war wasn't over. It was just beginning. And if Brenda was willing to take it to the county level, then I needed to start thinking about what I was actually willing to do. What was I willing to risk? And more importantly, what did I actually want the outcome to be? Did I want to win? Or did I want Brenda to actually understand what she'd done? I sat down at my kitchen table and started making a new list. Not a list of violations this time. Not a list of complaints or rules or regulations. A list of possibilities. Because Brenda had just made this personal in a way that went beyond property disputes and community aesthetics. She tried to use government power against me. And if there's one thing I've learned about bullies like Brenda, it's that they're counting on you to stay within the lines. They're counting on you to follow the rules. But what happens when you stop following the rules? What happens when you get creative? I looked at my list and started making calls. First, I called Patricia and Linda. Then I called Derek. And then I called my brother. And then I called my brother. My brother Steven is a real estate developer. He's successful, well-connected, and most importantly, he knows how to work within systems to create leverage. I told him everything. The green paint, Brenda's violations, the county complaint, all of it. He listened quietly, and when I finished, he asked me one simple question. "Do you want to destroy her, or do you want to win?" I thought about that for a long time. "I want her to learn," I said finally. "I want her to understand what she's done. To people. To this whole neighborhood." Stephen was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Okay, I have an idea, but you need to trust me completely." So I did. Over the next 3 weeks, Stephen worked his magic. He started with some calls to his lawyer friends. Then he reached out to Patricia and Linda, who had been gathering more evidence about board misconduct. He helped them organize a formal petition to remove Brenda from her position. But that wasn't the main plan. The main plan involved money. Stephen discovered that the HOA's financial records were a mess. Brenda had been signing off on expenses that didn't quite add up. Landscaping bills that seemed inflated. Management company fees that appeared excessive. Nothing explicitly illegal, but certainly suspicious enough to warrant an independent audit. He also discovered that the neighborhood had significant untapped potential. The common areas, the small park, the community center, the green spaces were all dramatically underutilized. They could be developed. They could be monetized. The residents could actually see a return on their HOA fees instead of just paying money into a black hole. Stephen called a meeting with Patricia, Linda, and 3 other neighbors who'd been particularly affected by Brenda's selective enforcement. They formed a slate to run against the current board, and they ran on one simple platform: transparency, fair enforcement, and better stewardship of community resources. Brenda didn't see it coming. When the special election was called, Brenda tried to fight back. She sent out emails accusing the insurgent candidates of being troublemakers. She organized a meeting where she tried to convince people that the current board was doing a great job. But the residents had already decided. They'd seen the records. They'd seen the violations that Brenda had ignored on herself while crushing other residents for minor infractions. They'd seen the county complaint filed against me. A complaint that led absolutely nowhere because there was nothing to find. And they'd had enough. The election happened on a Saturday morning. I didn't attend, but I got a text from Derek within an hour. Patricia and 2 other candidates had won by landslides. Brenda lost her position as president. She didn't even make it onto the board. She'd been voted out entirely. I should have felt triumphant. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I felt something more complicated. On Monday, Patricia called me to meet her at the community center. She was now the interim president of the HOA while they restructured the board and implemented new policies. "We're making some changes," Patricia said when I arrived. "Real changes. We're implementing a transparent violation system. We're creating an appeals process. We're establishing guidelines so that enforcement is consistent across all residents." "That's good," I said. "And we're reversing your violation notice," she continued. "The one about the paint. And all the other violations Brenda tried to pile on you at the end there." I nodded. "There's something else," Patricia said, and she had this uncomfortable expression on her face. Linda did some digging into Brenda's background, into why she was so obsessed with control and rules. "And Brenda's going through a rough time," Patricia said. "She and her husband are getting divorced. They're fighting over the house. The hot tub deck you documented? Apparently her husband built that without telling her, and she used the HOA rules to try to force him to remove it. That's why she was so paranoid about enforcement. She thought if she could prove that everyone violated the rules, then he would have to take down the deck too." I felt something shift inside me. Not sympathy exactly, but understanding. "Is she okay?" I asked. Patricia shrugged. "Depends on your definition of okay. Her life's kind of falling apart. Her marriage is ending. She lost the one thing she had power over. Her neighbors all think she's a nightmare." I walked out of that meeting and drove to Brenda's house. I don't know why. I wasn't planning to. It just happened. Her driveway was empty. The commercial truck was gone. The landscaping had been cleaned up. The peeling paint had been fixed. Everything was back to perfect, soulless beige. I sat in my car for a long time, and I thought about how winning isn't always what you think it's going to be.
Ide destruye Brenda's control.
I'd exposed her hypocrisy. I'd mobilized an entire neighborhood against her. But in the process, I'd also learned that she was just a scared woman who'd been trying to control the only thing she could control, and when that got taken away, everything else fell apart. It didn't make her right. It didn't excuse how she treated me or anyone else, but it did make her human. A week later, I got an unexpected visitor. It was Brenda. She showed up at my cabin on a Saturday afternoon, and she looked smaller somehow. Tired, like the fight had gone out of her. "Hi," she said when I opened the door.
I raplia.
"I owe you an apology," she said. "Multiple apologies. I was a lot of things I shouldn't have been. I didn't say anything. I just waited. Your house is beautiful," she continued, looking at the green walls. "I was wrong about that. I was wrong about a lot of things." "Yeah," I said. "You were. The county complaint I filed," she said. That was cruel. I was angry and I wanted to hurt you the way I thought you'd hurt me. Even though you didn't hurt me, you just stood up for yourself. She looked down at her hands. I'm leaving the neighborhood, she said. I've sold the house. My husband and I are finalizing the divorce, and I'm moving back to my parents' place while I figure things out. I didn't know what to say to that. I'm sorry, Marcus, she said. I'm sorry for everything. And then she turned around and walked back to her car. I watched her drive away, and I realized that this was the real ending. Not the victory over the board. Not the election. Not the vindication. It was this moment. This quiet moment where someone you've been fighting with actually sees you. Actually sees what they've done. I don't know if Brenda will be different at her next place. I don't know if she learned anything or if she's just moving on to start the cycle over somewhere else. But I know that I learned something. I learned that power corrupts, but so does powerlessness. I learned that sometimes people do terrible things because they're scared. I learned that revenge tastes good for about a second and then it just tastes like regret. And I learned that my green cabin is beautiful exactly the way it is. Not because I won the right to keep it that color, but because I actually stood up and said something mattered to me. And I didn't back down. The paint on my walls has stayed the same forest green for 3 more years now. Brenda moved away. Patricia's been doing a great job as board president. The HOA is actually functional now instead of being a playground for one woman's control issues. And sometimes, when I sit on my wraparound porch and look out at the neighborhood, I see all those beige houses. But I also see them a little differently now. They're not all the same because everyone wants them to be. They're all the same because someone convinced everyone that different was bad. I'm just glad I was the one who finally said it wasn't. Sometimes standing up to bullies doesn't make you a hero. Sometimes it just makes you honest. And that's enough. And that's where the story ends. 3 years later, and my cabin still stands in that neighborhood exactly the way I painted it. Forest green with cream trim. Unapologetically beautiful. But what I realized through all of this wasn't about winning against Brenda or proving I was right. It was about understanding that sometimes the people who hurt us the most are the ones who are hurting themselves. Brenda wasn't trying to ruin my life because she was evil. She was trying to control the only thing she could control because everything else was falling apart. That doesn't excuse what she did. It doesn't make the harassment okay or the false county complaint acceptable. But it does make her human. And it does mean that destroying her completely wouldn't have fixed anything. The real victory wasn't taking away her power. The real victory was learning to stand up for what I believed in while still having compassion for someone who didn't show me any. That's harder than revenge. That's harder than winning. But it's also the only way to actually move forward. So if you're dealing with your own Brenda right now, someone who's trying to control you, someone who's making your life difficult, someone who won't leave you alone, remember this. You don't have to destroy them to defeat them. You just have to be honest about who you are and what you believe. You just have to stand firm. And eventually the noise fades away. The bullies move on. And you're left with your green cabin and your peace. And that's worth more than any victory ever could be. Thank you so much for watching all 3 parts of this story. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments if you have your own HOA horror story. I'd love to hear about it. Because the truth is, there are a lot of Brendas out there. And there are a lot of people just like you trying to live their lives, trying to be themselves, and getting pushed around by people who think they have the right to decide what that should look like. You don't have to accept that. You never did. So paint your cabin green. Or blue. Or pink with purple polka dots if that's what makes you happy. Because your home is yours. And your life is yours. And nobody, not the HOA, not the Brendas of the world, not anyone, gets to take that away from you. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.